Hello and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. My name is James, your host. I started this podcast to help other folks share their own healing stories and to interview thought leaders and experts in the carnivore, keto, and low oxalate space. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to Equip Foods and the Carnivore Bar. As an affiliate, you can use the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products when you check out using the code Carnivorist. Thanks in advance for listening, subscribing, and any likes or shares. And now, on with the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. It's James, your host. It is my pleasure to welcome a friend of mine who I met at Keto Con this year, and we hit it off instantly. And it's an honor to have this gentleman on the podcast today with me. This is Chris Bates. Chris, welcome to Carnivorist Chats, my friend.
Thanks, James. It's quite an honor to be here.
Yeah, the honor is all mine. I am intrigued by your story. I am also honored by your presence and have been watching you in the social media space. And we have a lot to dig into here, Chris, because I know I told you a bit of my story when we first linked up at Keto Con, which was an amazing experience, by the way. And I encourage all the listeners to attend if you get a chance. Let's really talk about now, Chris, about you, where you're from originally, a little bit of background so the listeners can understand how you evolved, and we'll get into this lifestyle coaching that you're into now. Please tell the listeners.
I am a Virginia boy, and not the kind of Virginia that might first come to mind, but the Shenandoah Valley, which we talked about before we got on the air, that you have a family connection there, which is great. It's beautiful, mountainous, the best combination of suburbia and wilderness for a kid growing up, which is great because over my life, I kind of veered away from that lifestyle and that way of living. There's pressures, societal pressures, going to college, getting an office job, making good money, getting married, settling down. And I think that over time, despite my healthy addiction to health experimentation, I kind of veered away from the mountains and the outdoors. And that's why coming full circle back to an evolutionarily consistent lifestyle led me back outdoors was so exhilarating to make that full circle. But the context of what happened in between, outside of the percentage of time I spent outdoors, was a lot of diet, lifestyle, exercise, even mindset and mental health experimentations, probably over the course of 12 to 14 years, depending on the topic. So I am 32 now, and somewhere around 18 to 20, I really started to get into each of these things. And I started to conduct experiments. So I'm not, I don't have any more certifications or formal education. I went down that route. I learned a lot, and I decided to just learn by doing and to learn from the anecdotes of the people that I worked with. So in college and as a younger man, I was just reading and absorbing everything and then trying, whether that was for 30 days, 60 days, a new type of workout, or for diets. I was 6 to 12 months was my minimum investment for diligently following it to see how it made me feel. And so about 10 to 12 dietary experiments into it, I found Dr. Paul, and I have been trying keto with not much luck. Probably wasn't doing right, and we can get into that later. But then I just felt great, and I was doing the animal based on the diet front and on the lifestyle front. And then next thing you know, I heard about Heart and Soil, applied, got a job, worked up to the role of health success team lead, which was their version for lead health coach. And then, 3 years later, I'm running my own business, and I still ardently believe in the animal-based way of eating. And here we are.
Love that. And yeah, that ironically, the day that I linked up with you was your last weekend at Heart and Soil. In those beginning stages, Chris, of your life, was there anything that caused this experimentation that you had? Was there anything you were trying to heal, like physiological or mental? Please let us know.
I'm fortunate that from a physiological standpoint, the only thing I really suffered that motivated me to try all these experiments was some things in the joint health realm. I was a very active kid, playing soccer, swimming, some backyard tackle football, and that kind of thing. And I always dislocated my knees or had bummed ankles or IT band issues, hip issues. And so that kind of led me to wanting to reduce inflammation through diet, and also working a lot on blood flow and mobility. And those have been amazing. I no longer suffer from any of those issues, but luckily I didn't have anything like autoimmune or other things that we often see with people who come to this kind of lifestyle. But on the mental side of things, I suffered from Actually, I don't like that word because it's somewhat victimizing. I chose to view the world in a light that might have been influenced by nutritional deficiencies and lifestyle, to be depressed and to consider taking my life. And after that experience and deciding not to, I had a renewed vigor, a sense of, the world is just so much brighter and it's my playground to experiment on. So that probably influenced me much more than the physical injuries and ailments. And it definitely motivated me to optimize my physiological health because I realized how intimately intertwined it was with my psychological health.
We were talking offline, Chris, and thank you in advance for sharing part of this story and agreeing to, is that you were so depressed that you actually, as you said, maybe thought of taking your own life, chambered a bullet in a gun, and still keep that bullet on your person to this day as a reminder of how low it can get. And just before I allow you to speak, please allow me just to tell the listeners one more time about my own experience with this. And it just points back to what you were saying, Chris, on how intertwined physiologically our diet can be with our mental health. And I had never experienced depression until I had been on the vegan diet for almost 6 years, and my health was failing me drastically to the point where most days towards the end there, before I regained my health, that I was praying to be taken out of my misery. And I became very angry. My marriage suffered because of it. I was depressed, anxious, brain fogged all the time. And all I'm saying that is to say is that it is a profound thing to realize when you do actually make the shift and come back to your health, how intertwined these things are and how separated they've become in the worldview these days. And please, that was a big diatribe into allowing you to please tell that story, man.
Well, you nailed it. The realization or identifying that they're not separate is probably the biggest piece of the puzzle for a lot of people. It was for me. And the the irony is I needed some help to get there. It's not like I had this epiphany on my own. I actually experienced one of my best friends attempting to take his life, and I saw how the aftermath of that was very destructive, and it was not localized to his life. It spread into his families and his friends and the community. And I realized, and after having since then lost a few friends actually, to suicide, whether violent or overdose, it's not a selfless decision. It's a very selfish decision, and I say that with a utmost admiration and love for myself, for how I used to think, as well as the friends that I've had who have both succeeded, unfortunately, and attempted. So I couldn't be more grateful, ironically, for his suffering. And luckily he's happy now and we're still good friends. And I don't think he would ever consider that. But seeing it so close, even though it was, 1 degree removed, was very powerful. And it caused a reframe that really changed my mindset on a permanent level. And so the 9mm bullet is tarnished and sits on my bedside table over there. And it's not some sort of it's not a morbid reminder. It's actually reassurance that you've been through this. You've built support systems and foundations in your lifestyle and your social circles that it will never get that hard. And I don't want to tempt fate, like I was telling you before, by saying this. I don't want to be in a biblical Job situation, but I know that no matter what the future holds, I will never revisit that mindset. And I'm hoping that part of that is by doubling down on the methodology of getting animal-based nutrition, of an evolutionarily consistent lifestyle, and of just awareness behind these things. Because I know a lot of men and women suffer. And part of it, I do believe, is related to nutrient deficiency or inadequacies or malabsorptions. But I think the other part is just perspective, like choosing to reframe. And so again, I'll be eternally grateful for my friends that have gone through that, because I was able to learn from their experience. And I think that's why I like to do all the experiments that I do and to work with people, because there's something about firsthand experience that trumps knowledge, whether that's through studies or influencers or whatnot. And I think those things are great and they have a place. But I would use the word irreplaceable to describe that firsthand or maybe 1 degree removed experience of changing your lifestyle and your mindset.
Thank you for sharing, Chris. Very, very powerful. Chris, I hope you don't mind just a couple more questions on that. About what age did this transpire for you and when did this happen?
I think it initially started to come on in middle school where I was becoming painfully more self-aware. I think it's probably a different age for everyone. But for me, after elementary school, where before I was primarily blissfully ignorant of what other people thought, I became way too analytical about other people's perceptions of me. And I think I actually created a lot of people's opinions. That you become hyper aware of what people might think about you, and that starts to distort your reality. So I think that was a lot of origination. I don't think middle school is really a great time for a lot of kids. There's a lot of things going on. And I just chose to take it poorly and to take it personally. And luckily, it was only a few years of that because it was probably halfway through my high school career that this occurred. And I was actually just telling a friend the other day, it was like a light switch was flicked and all of a sudden everything was illuminated. I could see after witnessing my friend's experience that I was in my own head and that the way to this kind of mental salvation was by just starting to take action on everything that I wanted to do instead of letting myself be oppressed from taking action and things. So that the last year or so of my high school, I was trying choir and different bands and track and going out for the musical and talking to girls and all these things that I had been deathly afraid of doing because I was and living in real fear of what my peers might think about it. And there's really something magical about not caring and while still being kind and considerate. I'm sure there's a happy medium for that concoction. And so that I was probably about 16 or 17. And so it was about a year or and a half of not experimenting, but experiencing that newfound lens of life that then I was like, all right, how do I reinforce this from a nutritional standpoint, from a lifestyle standpoint? How do I let my body exemplify this alteration that I've made in my mind? And that's kind of what led to all the rest.
I'd like to just kind of segue from that point because it does dovetail nicely into something that you often talk about, Chris, and that's failing forward. Tell the listeners a little bit about all the diets that you failed forward with and what happened to you on those dietary choices over the years, man.
Well, I've done what I think is probably very common dietary or intake evolution, right? Where people are eating the sad American diet, and then there's variations of vegetarianism or veganism. And then they start to realize they're not feeling so good. So paleo comes back around. And there were some offshoots there. So I was fruitarian for a time, which actually, out of all of the non-animal based eating, that is when I felt the best. I just simply couldn't eat enough. But then when it came to integrating animal foods, I did what I like to call dirty keto, because it was not the kind of keto you should be doing. I was still learning a lot at that time about the nuance behind food quality. And then pescatarian was in there, and then proper keto was further after, and then paleo, and then another stint of keto, and then animal based. And I've pretty much been animal based for the last 3 years. And I say that because for someone who is addicted to experimenting on these fronts, it takes a lot for me to stop at a way of eating. Now, I don't believe that I'll eat this way for forever, but I do think that there are parts of animal based that will be a foundation of whatever I choose to do next. And honestly, that was the same for all the diets before that. Transitioning from SAD to vegan or vegetarian, I started to notice a difference in processed foods and unprocessed foods. And then when I went into paleo, I was thinking more about protein. And then as I moved into animal-based, I was thinking about bioavailability of nutrients and an evolutionary lens to analyzing the efficiencies and the effectiveness and the benefits of eating real food. So I know that going forward, we'll probably discover new things about nutrition, and I'm not at the forefront of that, but I am always experimenting based off of the forefront of those findings. So I'm excited to see how my lens might change, what experiments I might do going forward. Under that animal-based umbrella in the last 3 years, I have really played with different kinds of ratios of carbohydrates to fats. In fact, I'm going to go strict carnivore early on next year for about probably 4 to 5 months, bookending with blood work and DEXA scan to see the results of that, because I've been moderate to higher carb since working at Heart and Soil for 2 to 3 years now, and I want to go back there and experiment and compare now that I've been here for a little bit. Some other experiments have been, whether or not to include things like oysters or unsweet vegetable or unsweet fruits, as Dr. Paul Saladino calls it, things like squash and zucchini. So that less eggs, more dairy, less dairy, and kind of just sussing out the different things under the animal-based umbrella. And I don't think those experiments will ever stop, because it's so fun to learn, even though at times, as you pointed out, they've come at a cost. I know that, man, I was a pro at going to the bathroom, and I don't know of anyone who really brags about that, especially when I was vegan. Fruitarian wasn't far behind. And it's interesting, energy levels have fluctuated a lot through all of those experiments. And so I do believe, like you said, there were times that I was divorced, and now I'm dating a girl, but in my marriage with my ex-wife, I do think that took a toll on our relationship too. Like you, there's probably other factors there, but that's why I think having a diet, or really a lifestyle, that supports the best version of yourself is essential for a healthy interpersonal relationship, because it offers the capacity to think clearly, to have patience, to lead with love and kindness, and all these things that we aspire to be. So, long answer, but all of that to say is there's been some cost, but I've accrued a lot of nuggets, and I like to call myself a hoarder of nuggets now, because I think that's where the magic is the nugget from each experiment, even if it's only one.
I completely agree, Chris. And I want to put a little feather in your cap, because, and I haven't ever shared this except at the time when I was at Keto Con, there was a big group dinner. A bunch of us went out to dinner, and had a bunch of folks asking me, as people do when they hear about my story, what are your thoughts now looking back on your time as a vegan? And I have to admit, at the time, and that was earlier this year, I said that I had a lot of regrets. I was kind of angry because of the things that veganism took from me. It took from me my health. It took from me my job at the time. It impacted my marriage, as I told you. For those 6 years, I was looking at the possibility of having children, but could not because my testosterone had tanked. And then I was also angry because I felt once afterwards that I had been severely duped, as a lot of vegans do, by a lot of the propaganda that is out in space, because you're looking at things with a lens of you're doing all these wonderful things for your body, for the planet and the animals. And then when you really have the blinders taken off and start investigating, yeah, I had never heard about failing forward until I listened to a few podcasts with you, and it's totally changed my perspective. And you just hit the nail on the head. Is it's quivers in your arrows for when you coach with folks and nailing in on what some of the things that they may be dealing with. And we're going to get into your coaching, but it also allows me to share nuggets with folks that may be going through it and reach out to me, because I get a ton of people reaching out to me and saying, listen, I tried this. It didn't work well for me. I would not recommend it. You're welcome to try it for yourself, but this was my experience. So thank you, man, for your wisdom in this approach, because I think it's sorely needed. And I've often talked about it and saying, it's worth experimenting, because I think there's a lot of dogma in this dietary space, and I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris, let me now just kind of segue, and it again, this is perfectly flowing here, as things tend to do with you, man. And I harken back to our conversation at Keto Con, is your time at Heart and Soil. What caused you to join Dr. Paul on his mission? How did you get hooked up with them, and tell us about your experience there?
I have to keep how I got there somewhat short, because I love it and it's a riveting story, but I could go on and on about it. The Spark Notes version is, I was in a marriage that I probably shouldn't have been, but I had started to take my destiny back into my own hands. And, 2020, COVID was making things interesting. I was living in the rural Charlottesville, Virginia, but I had a voracious appetite for digesting podcasts, and I was on to my next experiment. And so then Dr. Paul went on Joe Rogan, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting because I was into the keto, but I hadn't really thought about animal based or really organs. And then there was a local grass fed farm out in this windy road in the mountains that I would go out to, and I was like, maybe I'll get liver from them next time. And I go out there, and the guy who owns the joint came out. He recognized me and my dogs, and he says, "Oh, are you here because of Dr. Paul Saladino?" I was like, "What are you? How do you know about that?" He's like, "No, we sold out a liver for weeks." So that was kind of like my first exposure to that. And then as I did acquire liver after they restocked, and it started to include other organs, and even got things from local hunters, because the deer problem in that part of Virginia is wild, so much so that I never had to go hunting because people had so much, they're just giving it away. There's even a homeless shelter program where they would make stew and other things out of these deer that were just getting killed left and right because the apex predators of the area had been killed out years ago. So all that to say is I had lots of deer cuts and lots of organs from them, and I got to experiment all these ways of eating it, and I just felt so much better. And I started following Heart and Soil shortly after, really going back through almost all of Dr. Paul's podcasts. And I was just, again, voracious appetite, couldn't get enough in terms of learning and application and just curiosity out the wazoo. And so I saw on Instagram one day, right before I went to bed, that they were looking to hire somebody, and they were very vague on the description for this role, and it stuck with me. And so I laid in bed next to my wife at the time, my now ex-wife, and she could tell I was restless. and she's like, what's going on? And she never asked me this. Typically it was out like a light. And I was like, I have to go do something. So I rushed upstairs to my office, and between the wee hours of 10 p.m. and probably like 3 or 4 a.m., I just wrote this heartfelt cover letter and messed around with some graphics to create a resume that was tailored to what I assumed they were asking for. But they left it somewhat ambiguous because they were hoping to see people's true colors instead of someone altering their resume and their cover letter to fit a certain job description, which I thought was very clever. And so I sent it off, didn't hear anything, and I was super bummed because it felt special to me. And especially not having renewed any certifications. I was working in the family business at mortgages. It had nothing to do with health, but I've been a lifelong advocate of experimenting. And this cover letter I wrote from the bottom of my heart that did have a lot of jokes at the expense of a vegan, unfortunately, it spoke to them. Mostly my passion for wanting to help spearhead this movement through devoting myself to a company that had a worthwhile mission. And so they flew me out. The company was really small. It was still working out of Paul's house, actually. There were like 6 or 7 of us. And then one thing led to another. And as he continued to get traction and spread the word, and since then, in the last three to 4 years, this whole movement, whether that's keto or animal-based, regenerative agriculture, all the parts to this spearheaded movement have gotten so much momentum, which is really encouraging to see. I was so fortunate and grateful to get on that tidal wave before it was technically a tidal wave, because really interesting to uproot my whole life in Virginia and basically put the nail in the coffin for my marriage and move out to Austin across the country, because I believed in this so much long before I knew that I would be compensated for my dedication and the hours that I was putting into it. And I do believe that walking the walk was also a big differentiator for me working there. And the company, now that I have my own business, I always advocate for that if that's what people are drawn to. But I always say that working there was the best place to be employed if you choose to be employed. So again, another long answer, but it was really exciting. It was almost like, a pinch me moment. I asked a lot of people literally to pinch me throughout this process because it didn't feel real. And it was truly an honor to be a part of that mission for the time that I was.
Thank you for answering that. And it is such a great company, and meeting all you guys down there on your last weekend was a phenomenal thing that I really, it was like a full circle moment for me because, as I mentioned to you, the products had been so instrumental in helping me get my health back on track. And then seeing you guys face to face, because I had always followed you all the way here in Bermuda on Instagram and on Facebook, and seeing your reels. And I was like, hey, man, I'm meeting Bates in person. This is pretty cool. Bates, before we leave the Heart and Soil era, and I want to touch a little bit, and it goes back to what we were discussing about on experimentation in our dietary choices. And it's that sort of polarizing topic when Dr. Paul switched his from carnivore and writing the carnivore code, and you know where I'm going with this, into adding fruits and honey and things like that back in his diet. When you were coaching for Heart and Soil, and even now with your clients, you often talk about people follow a dietary pattern where they go into this and then go carnivore and then become more on animal based and adding products back in. In a general sense, did you find that early on at Heart and Soil that when Dr. Paul made the change that it was helping people overcome certain things by adding fruit and honey or maple syrup or whatever they choose back in their diet?
Generally, yes. There's a lot of outliers for almost everything, including some vegans and vegetarians who are trying to switch to animal based. And it's difficult to encapsulate, but I believe that I know that there is some individual variance based off of, let's say, physical exertion, stress, environment, maybe genetics, and all these other things. I know a lot of this is highly contested. I saw at Heart and Soil, to kind of remove my opinion and share the anecdata, because I saw about probably 12 to 13,000 anecdotes during my 3 years there, at least. I would say that the grand majority of people that came in as vegan and switched to animal based saw amazing improvements. And I'm sure most of your listeners and you would probably not surprised by that. Now, the people who were keto and switched to a higher carb animal based variation, I would say 60 to 70% of them self-reported. Obviously, we don't have the metrics of like the blood work and all these things, but self-reported improvements. And then, 30 to 40% said they felt better on keto. And I don't know why that is, but I can tell you through the percentage that did experience benefits, most of those were related to electrolyte management, athletic output, and thyroid and testosterone or other hormonal levels, even sleep quality sometimes. And I know that there's a ton of reasons why that might be, and I'm probably not the person to talk about that at length. But what I can say is based off of those anecdotes, many before and after, that I believe the jury is still out on that. So I don't really take a side, and that's not because I'm trying to imitate Switzerland in this war. I just simply believe it's more nuanced than that. And so I'm eager to discover more about it as I continue to experiment. So what I did at Heart and Soil and what I do now with my clients is I encourage people to try it both ways, because I'm not smart enough to tell them one way or the other that this is the way. And I think that's a little silly. I would rather them experiment within a safe infrastructure where we know they're probably see benefits one way or the other, and then they can pick what resonates with them based off of firsthand experience. But it was highly contested when Dr. Paul kind of switched. I remember I would spend 10 to 12 hours a day answering emails or comments or what have you, trying to say like, yeah, we get it. We're not like losing it. This is like an alteration that we think people should try. And again, it worked for a lot of people. And for the people that didn't, I do wonder if maybe they had an optimized lifestyle. A lot of these people had been either living off the grid or off the land in more remote areas. So I'm not sure if there's anything to do with that. I know there's some theories about stress from air quality and noise pollution and mold and other things that you find more in metropolitan areas over the rural areas. So I'm not sure the exact reasons to all this, but like I said, in my mind, the jury is still out, but I have seen both low carb and high carb under the animal based or the keto carnivore umbrellas work for different people better than the other two options of the three.
I would add as well that my own experimentation, once again, Chris, was that I thought, I when I added animal foods back in my diet, it was about as near as instant to feeling right away. They talk about the vegans brain lighting up when you do that. And I can attest to that. And I was like, all right, less is more on this diet. I could cut out all the vegetables and all the fruits and went strict carnivore for a while. And then, similarly to Dr. Paul and a lot of other people, I'm sure, I began to experience electrolyte issues, cramping, things of that nature. But what I also realized is there's also nuance on the oxalate side, which I'm sure you've heard and talked about with Dr.
Mhm.
Paul and your time at Heart and Soil. I've had Sally Norton on here. I've had Monique Attinger. And clearly with me, after doing a lot of investigation, I ate a lot of the high oxalate foods, like literally bombed my body. And I'm still dealing with the repercussions to this day. But oxalates also bind minerals on their way out of the body. So that's going to contribute to your electrolyte loss. So I added fruits back into this to this day. I haven't had any vegetables since because I swore down, man, those evil things.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, even though I enjoyed some of them, not all of them, but things like winter squashes and stuff like that. But I have not, and my digestion has improved tremendously. And then I found that little carbohydrate source was a multi-pronged approach for me to help with the oxalate dumping, to help with the little carbohydrates before bed. So I typically have them in the evening, but it is so nuanced, man. This whole, and I'm like you, and I love talking to experts in the area and continuing to learn about this because, and I'm going to continue to experiment on myself as well, man.
Mhm.
I cannot be dogmatic. I left that dietary choice behind when I left the vegan diet for sure. As I mentioned prior, that last time we spoke was your last weekend with Heart and Soil. And as you've just mentioned, you are now out on your own doing coaching. Talk to us about that and how difficult a decision that must have been for you to leave that, pinch me job and go
Mhm.
out on your own. And what was sort of a little bit of the thought process behind that, if you don't mind sharing?
It's a great question. And honestly, there's no better way to describe it than it felt like divorce all over again, because I was married to the idea of being at that company and I was married to that mission. And as Heart and Soil evolved, I realized that I was probably better suited in the earlier stages because I liked, like creating and connecting with people and doing all these very micro interactions, very interpersonal based interactions, and they were starting to grow and try to help the masses. And I'm still an advocate for helping things on a macro level, but fundamentally I believe that that starts with your circle of influence. And me as an individual, I wanted to help a smaller group of people in a deeper way than tons of people on a shallow level. And I do think there are better tools for that. So that's part of why I'm doing all these podcasts as a guest, is because I do want to contribute to both realms. But I think my specialty was in the one-on-one realm. And I really couldn't do that as much as Heart and Soil at the end as I could in the beginning. So kind of identifying what kind of tool I was to aid in this movement and to help other people like you and I have been helped or help ourselves. I had to go to the coaching route. So it took me a while to come around to that. And I learned a lot because I think when you have that fundamental realization, your behavior changes. And I am not proud of, kind of like pushing back on the changes of the company while I was there, but I did it with like the goal of preserving the culture and doing right by the customers. And I learned a lot about myself from that. And I left on great terms. In fact, I'm very proud, no matter what business I've left, barring one where I just left the day of because I had been mistreated for so long. I've always done my best work at the end as kind of like a goodbye gift for, and that company was like my family. So it was a very difficult decision. And I wanted to leave them as best as possible, which is why Keto Con was my last project. So I was heading that up and organizing it, making sure everything went well. And we had a great time. And like you said, highly recommend that to anyone who can attend this coming year. But it felt right. So even though it was painful, like most people's decisions, once you move on to the next thing, you pretty much know if it was the right decision or not. And so although I was learning a ton, very humbled and a little bit frightened by what the future was hold, I was twice as much when it came to feelings of excitement and prosperity and feeling like I had the ability to help some individuals on a really deep level. And so it was a mixed bag to summarize. And I'm really grateful for my experience at Heart and Soil because I don't know that I would have ever realized that this was more of something that I felt called to do, or a coach was more of something that I was called to be.
Wisdom Wednesdays. We're doing it right now, brother. I'm telling you.
Nice.
On that note, I want to get into something. We're going to start digging into your coaching business and some of the, again, the wisdom gems that you drop on folks. And I really appreciate. I want to say I appreciate your presence online, man. It's just an approachable one. You're honest, you're genuine, and I know it resonates with people. So I will make sure that I put all the links where to find you in the show notes for this episode for sure. But in your Instagram handle, I was just, taking a peek around, man, and you have something which you refer to as the trifecta of wealth. And I thought it was interesting that you chose the word wealth there, because there's always this dichotomy between wealth and health. Is health wealth, or is wealth and you get health? And you talk about physiological, psychological, and interpersonal trifecta of health. How do you break that down? What do you dig into to get that on your handle and for your clients when you have them, man? That's a big one, I know.
Yeah, it might be too much, but it's kind of a personal memento of thought, if anything. We talked about how the psychological and the physiological health are intertwined, and I think the interpersonal health is right there. And the reason I chose wealth is because everybody has their own definition of success. Mine is not very traditional. I believe true wealth is the things that you can't buy. And for me and the people who come to me, having a plethora of quality of life in those three areas is actual wealth, is a currency that you can trade like other currencies, but at your peril. And so I would rather accumulate those kinds of wealth in those three areas over wealth in terms of money. And I don't think money is inherently evil. In fact, there was a time when I was a younger, hippier version of myself, walking across campus barefoot with dreadlocks and dumpster diving for my vegan diet, vegetables that have been like one day expired from the local grocery marts. I would have told you a much different story where I thought money was evil, but it's just a currency. It's just an exchange. But I don't think, if that's anybody's final goal, then they probably need to recalibrate their sights a little bit. And I think that resonates with a lot of people who come to me. And I do think that by focusing on those things, the money comes later. Most people I know that focus on those three things do accumulate monetary wealth, but it's a byproduct of how they choose to live their lives and how they choose to be the best version, the best iteration of themselves. And so I tried my best to practice what I preach. And I think that's why that's up there, because it's kind of the crucible of my personal philosophy as well as my coaching style.
Really poignant. And you have this way with words and combining things or simplifying things so they come across, but if you start to really dig into what you're saying, there is a much deeper level. Speaking of which, I want to talk about this one too, because this applies to me in a way you just have no idea. My whole upbringing, I was almost criticized for this, and that is coming to the point where you describe yourself as being reasonably disagreeable. What does it mean to be reasonably disagreeable in your mind? I think it's fabulous, by the way.
Yeah, I have to say that I think this thought process was influenced a lot by Jordan Peterson's work, and a lot of which I dug into while I was trying to salvage my marriage, which was probably well over half the time that I was married, over 5 years. I realized after identifying that being overly agreeable led to relationship issues or hurdles, that it wasn't unique to that sector of my life. And so I like reasonable disagreeability because it, in tandem, it hauls around radical transparency. You have to be very forthcoming about your boundaries and your limits, and it saves everybody around you time. I'm a big fan of efficiency, and I'm trying to think of a good example to illustrate this, and I'm not sure that I have one, but the concept is that choosing the hard way in the short run saves you exponential time on the back end. And I think when you're overly agreeable, it comes from a really good place where you want to compromise for the sake of those around you. Typically, like let's remove the people on the ends of the spectrum that might be sociopaths or whatever. Most people, I would argue, are good people, and most of them want to accommodate for the people that they love or the people they interact with. but it comes at a price, because when boundaries are pushed, you foster resentment, you build up obligation. And this is the same in the health world too, I believe, as in the interpersonal world. And in the psychological world, it's the conversations you have with yourself, because whether or not you know it, you are at odds with yourself, and you push your own boundaries and you push back on those boundaries because you have agreements that you've made with yourself. So if I'm to summarize it, I think that it's people with kindness and consideration should communicate precisely what they want, because it will save you time, attention, efforts, emotional pain, and all of these things. And it's like being at a restaurant and deciding that you don't want to ask the waiter if the burger is cooked in seed oils because you don't want to be inconvenient for him. Well, it's your health. You're paying for the burger. Being reasonably disagreeable is saying in a polite way, hey, do you know what kind of oil you guys cook in? And he might have to run and check with the chef in the back and come back out, but that's part of his job. You can pay for him for that. You can compensate that with a tip, and you're preserving your health because that's a non-negotiable for you. And that's somewhat of a rudimentary or rather Neanderthal-ish example, but that's the only one that came to mind. But I think it's really difficult in romantic relationships for people to exemplify this same level of being reasonably disagreeable. And I do believe compromise is part of a long-lasting, healthy relationship. But if you've gone too far, you'll know it, because you will feel that sense of resentment, or keeping a tabs or a ledger on who has done more for who, and these kinds of things. And so it's something I'm always working on, because I grew up very agreeable, and it in every example I could possibly think of over my 32 years of living, no matter how honorable the intention, there's always more downside. And I don't typically speak in absolutes, but this is the one thing that I have a lot of conviction on at this point in my life, and maybe I'll be proven wrong later. But I've noticed switching to being reasonably disagreeable, as long as I insert an appropriate amount of kindness and consideration, and I focus on communicating effectively, that it goes over much smoother anyway. People actually respect you, or maybe even more magnetized to you, and will give you more of the time of day when you don't sugarcoat things just to accommodate for them. And there's a lot of nuance with that, because each situation, each person is going to be a little bit different. But I think just if people just ask themselves in this moment, is this a compromise that I can afford to make because I don't have any built up obligation and resentment? Or is this a compromise that is going to have a future toll on me? And I think asking that question will help people position where they are in terms of, negotiating with themselves or their others, or their loved ones.
On that note, Chris, I wanted to talk about a reel that you made that maybe I'm going to be reasonably disagreeable here.
Do it.
It was the Irish exit reel.
Mm.
For those folks that don't know, an Irish exit is when you attend a party and you mingle and you talk to folks and you leave, you exit without going back to say goodbye. And there was a lot of interesting feedback on that reel that you made.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to be reasonably disagreeable here, because I don't know that going back and returning, I know you said you die on this hill, is completely necessary, man. And I just want to have that discussion, because it's been an interesting thing over the years with me. I had an older gentleman at the time who swore by the Irish exit. And he was I'm one of the nicest guys you could ever meet. And he was very influential on me growing up. And perhaps this is why I'm dying on my own hill over here.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just to give an example of the reasonably disagreeable thought, is that maybe that those few minutes with those folks was all that was necessary. And is the going back, is it to appease something in ourselves that we have to have this closure, or that, we're doing it for them rather than for ourselves? Because innately we're going, yeah, I'd kind of like to leave now. I feel like I've made the rounds and spoken to folks, but no, for etiquette's sakes, maybe I need to go back. I mean, it's just something that I thought about since I saw your reel.
Yeah, that is a really excellent point. I hadn't thought about it that way. And there is a chance that it is a fragment of my leftover unreasonable agreeability. And that reel that was Nick Gray. He's the author of a book called The 2-Hour Cocktail Party. And so he's all about events and trying to make genuine connections, but in an efficient manner. And so my stance on that was, people take note when you take a few extra seconds of your time to give them goodbye. And I think human touch is also really important. Now, I might be projecting because I'm a hugger. I meet people and it's like a high five, handshake, and a hug at minimum. And it does add some time when I leave these events, but I don't do it with everyone. I try to do it with the people that I believe I connected with and that I'd like to see again. So I do wonder now that you're saying it, how much of that is subconscious etiquette. But I do think a fraction of it is also, it's like, I want these people to know that I connected with them. So I am willing to invest some extra time in saying goodbye. But I don't believe that, especially depending on the size of the event and these things, that you should have to say that to everybody. And there probably is a little bit of a personality and disposition element to it. But it was a highly controversial reel. Nick has a much larger following, and he's one of my girlfriend's best friends, and he's hilarious, and he loves to hit the controversial nail on the head. And it was funny to see how many people such a simple concept could get a rise out of them. And a lot of people had good reasons on both sides of the fence. But I really do believe that when you invest time as if it's not a scarce resource, that's a wise way to invest it. I know that sounds very counterintuitive, but I just really believe that the right things work out in the end. And so having the courage to invest in the people that you're drawn to, even if it will add up to a lot of time, but in that moment, it's a few extra minutes. I do believe it's worth spending that, even if nothing comes out of it, because who does that nowadays? I think it kind of harkens back to an old age way of thinking, which I very much identify with. But again, to your point, maybe there's some underlying agreeability that I need to deal with there. So I appreciate you making that more pointed, because I might have missed that otherwise.
No, man. And there is no right or wrong answer here. I just saw a lot of the responses from the introverts, and I know not being one and having been in either relationships with some or working with others, how difficult it can be. And again, as I mentioned to you earlier, your stuff is just so thought provoking. I'm like, let me just think about this for a second. Then I listened to you talking about reasonably disagreeable, and I was like, I had always been such a people pleaser. I really wonder if it does harken back to an etiquette thing. And trust me when I tell you, Chris, that I'm still doing it myself. And I do believe it is a proper thing to do. However, it just opened up the questions for me. So thank you for that, man. Thank you for that little digression on that
Of
road.
course. Yeah, I wasn't expecting that. So that's fun to dissect a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. What I wanted to talk about next as we start to wind down a little bit, Chris, is the need for coaching in today's world. I really started to think about that. And I listened to you talk to other podcasters about how our worlds have become, how smaller they've become, with you and I talking, meeting at Keto Con, and now on Zoom having this podcast together, and how things have changed, the stressors in our life, both physiological and mental, as you talked about, and the need for coaching. And one of the things that you talked about on the podcast, and I'll let you speak in a second because it ties into this, is the toggling in this world. This toggling, and is it wearing us out as we go back and forth between the modern lifestyle and trying to live like Dr. Paul is teaching us now in our ancestral past? What are you finding now with folks and the need for coaching, especially here? Are you getting a lot more younger folks, older folks? This is a big mix.
I would say men between the ages of 23 to 45 are typically the people that are drawn to my methodology with coaching and my persona. And toggling is such a huge skill that I believe everybody, including myself, could stand to be much more proficient at. And to illuminate that idea a little more for the listener, if I'm thinking of the podcast that you're referencing correctly, it had to do with modern dating, and how men specifically should be able to toggle where in one mode they are being like foundational, a leader, assertive, taking charge, and then worrying, essentially carrying the responsibility of all the beings in their life, whether that's dogs, women, children, colleagues, whether they run a team at their work, all these things, toggling into a more playful, carefree mode. And how modernity makes that very difficult. And likewise, on women's side of things, there's this whole movement for being a boss babe and getting your bag and basically emulating what was traditionally the successful businessman. But then they have problems toggling into the more natural feminine state. That's probably the state that's most desirable from a partnership between a man and a woman. And I believe that modernity had just made this so complicated and so complex because we're so worried about going through an entire checklist and achieving all these things and being overstimulated and not having evolutionarily consistent periods of substantial rest and all these things that we're just buzzing. And so we don't have the time to slow down. And I think slowing down is a precursor for toggling with proficiency. And so that is something I'm actively trying to instill in myself, especially as I've launched my own coaching business and figuring that out, building the plane after I've jumped off the cliff. It's extremely more challenging than it was prior for me to toggle into that play mode. And so I notice I take myself too seriously, and that comes out at a lot of detriment. And I'm ironically show up best as a coach and a romantic partner and a friend when I am getting the proportionate amounts of each of those modes. And so the proficiency, I believe, comes in knowing when you have to toggle into your responsibility and being a leader and having this foundation of securing everything that needs to get done and having a sense for that, while also toggling into your carefree, adventure, playful, big kid mode as often as possible. So the one is needed and it's necessary, but you're not trying to spend excessive time there. And it can get really easy for guys or women who are especially are single or vocational focused to get stuck in there and not toggle back. And that's not really fun for anyone. I mean, I guess I could have summed this up by all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and that old adage is very true in my experience. But I do believe, to tie this back into a health and nutrition piece, I do believe that for me, toggling became easier the healthier I got. And it kind of is also related to that psychological health piece that we've been talking in and about, that when you have the feel on a chemical level, a molecular or cellular level, it's easier to be more aware of this and to kind of be the master of your own mental destiny. And yeah, this concept of toggling continues, like a lot of things, to be a theme in multiple realms of life. And so it's more of a newer theory for me. And when I work with my clients, I just try to encourage them to find balance. And that's probably an older word that represents this idea, or a more used term that represents this idea. But the toggle is a really good metaphor for a visualization for people to actually understand that each mode has inherent value. The trick is knowing when to flip the switch one way or the other.
Great answer. And I'm sitting here listening to you, Chris, and talk about this, and it just made me realize that, I had mentioned, modern society and the challenges, and myself being 51 now, and I had the privilege, and I do call it a privilege, of growing up in the 80s and 90s when all this technological advances now with cell phones and these computers and Zoom calls and this inundation we have now, and even AI these days was just not there. And I think back to the toggling in my youth, even into my 30s, where, like you said, I should have toggled into more serious nature now looking back. But I wonder, was that because I hadn't gone through any struggle? And I'm thinking now that the struggle causes that toggling, because I was carefree, happy, spending money, doing all this stuff, living life like there was no tomorrow. And then all reality crashing in when my health went down and I struggled. And then it caused me to toggle into a much more serious, because I'm sure when you're coaching folks, when they reach out to you, it's because they're like, yeah, I need to fix something and fix it quickly, or I'm going to be headed for a demise here. And similar to myself. So I toggled into that serious mode. And what I'm struggling with now is, if you had known me in the past, I was the joker, man.
Really?
I was, man. I was always the funny guy at the parties, outspoken, joking. So now I'm struggling now because I'm very serious and I'm locked in on what I'm doing here with this podcast. But I just realized that I need to take that break. We need to take that toggling back into that joyous state from time to time. And this is a great way for me to ask you, and excuse me again, but I just love this conversation. The way it goes is, you recently took a really good break to write part of a book. And I'm just intrigued to know how that went and what was the cause for that. And if you can give us a sneak peek of what you're writing about.
I appreciate such a insightful question that shows like you really pay attention. And by the way, I noticed that with all of the episodes of yours I've listened to it. And so quick shout out to you for doing your research and having due diligence for coming up with really great questions for your guests. It shows, and I can feel it because now I have an opportunity to speak about what's most near and dear to me, and I love that. So thank you for that marvelous question. Part of what I was writing serendipitously is about modern dating and a little bit of this toggle. And so I love to experiment on the adventure front as much as all the other fronts that we've discussed. I had never gone on a trip alone where I didn't interact with another human. And I wanted to stack that experiment with being productive or doing something that was mentally stimulating. And I've had this idea for a book that I wrote the rough outline for that I wanted to just write the rough draft. So I stacked it with that. And I also stacked it with nature and took my dogs. And it was interesting kind of toggling while I was there because my objective was to write the rough draft of this book, but I knew that I needed to take breaks. So I'm not a huge fan of excessive intermittent fasting or excessive fasting. I do practice a long-term fast once in a while, but I didn't have much of an appetite for eating. I had mostly an appetite for writing. And so the entire time I was there, I would write for a few hours and then I would, walk around this property that was out in the middle of nowhere, it's Airbnb, and explore the woods with the dogs, lay out in the sun and go back to writing for a few hours. And it was amazing how much easier it was to toggle between those two modes, which I would consider one is, even though I was unencumbered by what I might be in my normal routine in terms of distractions, I still was definitely in that let's go get it done mode. And then when I toggled to the playful mode, it was relatively frictionless. There wasn't much resistance at all. And so as I reflect on it, and now that you've asked me that question, I do think that is a great representation, and on a scale of N of one, that the distractions of modernity, whether those are conscious or obvious or subconscious, really incapacitate our ability to toggle with proficiency from those modes. So I wrote about modern dating, kind of citing some of my experience through my marriage and trying to salvage that to becoming single, moving across the country and being thrown into the dating world in a metropolitan area, which I had not, before lived in an area like that. So there's a lot of rules to help men primarily, but maybe even women, to date with integrity in the dating world. And a lot of these principles we've talked about are in there with that lens on it. And it was so fun to write about for anybody who hasn't done a writer's retreat or a solo trip or anything like that. I can't recommend it enough. And that's coming from someone who is glaringly gregarious and very extroverted. So highly suggest, whether it's just to regain a little bit of peace or stability, or if it's to churn out a creative project. I think both of those are really great avenues and well worth the time. But it was interesting because I was writing about toggling, but then I also had to practice it. And the seamlessness was nothing, or actually everything, so much more impressive than when I am in my routine trying to force that same kind of toggle. So it does kind of confirm to me that a lot of it are things beyond our control, which I would argue makes it even more important to raise awareness around and to practice, to become extra proficient so that the ingrained aspects of modern life don't remove our ability to toggle at all.
So love that, man. And I would venture to say that on that solo trip and in your current relationship, you are entering into the Garden of Eden zone. As
Oh
you
yeah.
yes, sir. And for those listeners, just give them a quick synopsis of what that means, because there definitely are zones. And again, I was just thinking back to the challenges, and we were talking about toggling and how toggling can allow us, when we take that moment as you did on this solo trip, and really put pen to paper, and we're by yourself, enter into that zone of what could be.
This is a great concept, and I didn't coin this at all, and I can't tell you where I found it. It might be Chris Williamson, actually. The Modern Wisdom podcast is a great podcast if anyone is unfamiliar. Essentially, there's a zone of comfort that many people reside in, and it's small and it's uncomfortable, but you can live there. And oftentimes, something terrible or something so negative that it influences you to make a change will shift you to this zone of extreme discomfort, where you are more likely to skip the zone of comfort into, it's not called the Garden of Eden zone, but I did say that on a podcast, to this, what I like to call the Garden of Eden zone, which is basically just saying what could be, like the better versions of yourself, how your life could be better, all these things. And it's really interesting because when you're in the Garden of Eden zone, and when you're in the zone of terrible discomfort that's motivating you to make a change, but you don't always know when you're in the zone of comfortability where you are living a less than ideal life, but you're not really sure, or you don't really have the motivation to make a change. So it's small and it's semi-comfortable, but I think it's the most dangerous zone because of that. And I would argue that even though the zone of extreme discomfort is not pleasant, that's the time spent there is the investment that brings to fruition everything that's worthwhile in the Garden of Eden zone. So it's a very interesting concept. And when I heard it, it got me thinking, like, am I in the zone of comfort? And I think about that often now. And I can tell you, when I left Virginia to come work at Heart and Soil, and for the first few months at Heart and Soil, I was in extreme zone of discomfort. But that period is, even when I was trying to salvage my marriage and I was starting to realize it just wasn't meant to be, for that 2.5, 3 year period, that was all a major zone of discomfort. But that's the zone of my last 10 to 15 years that has most defined me and has most shaped me to become capable at what I do choose to be passionate and what I do choose to sink my time and attention into now. So it's one of those things where you almost, even though it sucks in the moment, you almost can't be unhappy with it, because you understand that it brings you prosperity, on the other side of things.
I know that a lot of people ask this question, but I'm just interested to hear your answer. Where do you want to be in 5, 10 years? What do you want to be doing, man? I'm just out of anyone I've ever asked this, I'm intrigued to hear, specifically because we were just talking about your book. Is continuing to write books something that you want to be doing? I know you probably want to continue to coach people, man.
I ask myself this question a lot, and I don't have a good answer. And a lot of people would say, well, planning or failing to plan is planning to fail. I like to think of my 3 or 5 year plan as more as a sentiment that I'd like to achieve, or an impact on the world or myself or those around me I'd like to achieve. Because I believe that when we get too granular, we set ourselves up for failure, and not the kind of failing forward failure, but rather falling short of our expectations of ourselves. And I believe that most of the opportunities that have been the most ripe for the picking and the most exciting have been ones that I haven't been able to predict. And so I'm in a new season of trying to visualize how I want to impact those around me and myself in the world for the better versus a specific outcome. And I know that's kind of a way to dodge your question. So what I will say is, I've always wanted to write a book. So I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to see how I feel about that when it's all said and done. And maybe I'll write more. And I guess at that point, you shift from a writer to an author. And I never would have thought, even a year ago, telling anyone that I was going to write a book or be an author or own my own coaching business. But I believe that there's a lot of really pure joy in the challenge of doing new things. So I expect, just like I'm experimenting on the diet side of things, I'll be experimenting on these vocational, professional fronts. I do hope in 5 years from now that, whether on the scale or the volume, I don't really care, but I just hope I am a voice of support and reason for however many number of people I have the pleasure of working with or connecting to through podcasting or through books. And I hope that all of these things they're multi-pronged. I hope it's a multi-pronged approach to leaving behind a legacy that's worthwhile. Because like you, I didn't just pick up the torch myself and lace it in tallow and light it on fire and say, oh, look at this amazing invention that I made that will change all of mankind. I had to stumble through and learn from other people and be inspired by other people to really make my life better on, again, the psychological, physiological, and interpersonal front. And so I hope to be, even in a small way, one of those people who can provide positive influence for others' development on the diet front and the psychological health and the interpersonal health front. So whatever that turns out to be, I'm okay. I'm already at peace regardless of the outcome. But I want to really help people as I've been helped, kind of a pay it forward mentality.
You're just going to be so successful at whatever you put your mind to, brother. I just know it. I feel it for you. I've watched you from your time at Heart and Soil to going in on your coaching business to speaking with you. It's an honor, man. It is truly an honor to sit here and chat with you. And I know I can hear my listeners screaming in my ear. Yeah, but James, where can we find Chris online? How can we get in touch with him for coaching? So please let the listeners know where they can find you.
That's really kind sentiment, by the way. I appreciate it. I think everybody needs a hype man. And I can tell that you do that for no matter how big or small in terms of following or impact that your guests have. You're always so encouraging, and I appreciate that, experiencing it firsthand. I'm kind of low on the radar right now. I'm sure one day I will have a more formal website and maybe some programs for people to do. But right now I'm just doing one-on-one coaching. If people want to find me, Animal Bates, which is animal and then Bates, my last name, which is also the name I go by. On Instagram is the primary way to find me. Reach out. I love connecting and talking with people. But I think until the book comes out and a couple other things that come out that I'm working on, that I'll be flying pretty low on the radar. That being said, I always love to connect. So I encourage anyone who any part of this podcast resonates with it, and you want to continue this discussion with me or have any comments or feedback on it. I love incubating these ideas with people. So please reach out.
Animal Bates. What an honor, a privilege it is to have had you on the chats today, man, on Wisdom Wednesdays when we're recording this. I have to have you back, my brother, because we did not even scratch the surface on other lifestyle hacks that you have used and digging a little bit more into diet and thought processes. You're just a wealth of information. And I want to say thank you for taking the time out and sharing this wisdom with myself and the listeners today.
It was my absolute pleasure, James. And like I said, I think you do a really great job, and I'm honestly just so stoked when we like nailed the date. I'm like, finally, I'm really pumped to talk with James. I've been looking forward to this since we met.
Thank you, brother. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your day, man. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, you too, James.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Carnivorist Chats. If you've made it this far, I want to say thank you for listening, and also thank you in advance for liking, subscribing, or sharing this episode. Thanks again to Equip Foods, Carnivore Snacks, and the Carnivore Bar. Don't forget to check the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products. Until the next time, be well.